SABC correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, thanks a lot for joining us. Now, let's look at this revised ban that Donald Trump signed. What's new here?
Well, I think this is, Tabile, a real political defeat for President Trump. I mean, this was essentially him backtracking on an initial executive order signed on the 27th of January, in which he professed in a tweet that he would fight for its reinstatement all the way up to the Supreme Court. Of course, you know, there were a number of court challenges. Successfully, the Washington State Attorney General basically calling for the suspension of the initial order, and that was upheld by a federal appeals court later. And so this is a huge political defeat for this president, because he has essentially not pursued this matter in the courts and basically signed a new executive order earlier today. What it does change, Iraq is one of the 7 countries that is now removed from the executive order. It leaves in place the bans against the citizens of 3 African countries and 3 Middle Eastern countries, all majority Muslim countries. The new executive order, and this is a very important point, it applies now only to non-visa holders, so essentially anyone without a valid permit to enter the United States. This created, of course, a great deal of consternation and chaos at ports of entry around the United States, because there was a great deal of confusion as to whether, for example, green card holders, valid visa holders, dual citizens were to be allowed back into the country. This executive order clarifies that point. It also doesn't go into effect immediately, Tabile. Initially, the first executive order was signed and implemented on the very same day. In this instance, the executive order is basically giving a week for processes to be implemented, particularly by Homeland Security staff. And it also does away with the exceptions for religious minorities. Initially, the first executive order would have allowed, for example, Christian minorities in the Middle East to apply for refugee status and to be given preferential treatment. This executive order does away with that religious test.
Sherwin, now you just mentioned that this is essentially political defeat for Donald Trump, saying that he backtracked on what he campaigned on also. What's the feeling amongst Republicans at the moment on this matter?
Well, Republicans have been very cautious. I think if you look at the 40-some-odd days of this presidency, they've been very reluctant. They've been very cautious in directly criticizing the Republican president, Donald Trump. That's been the purview of Democrats, the minority party in Congress and in the Senate. And so what you're seeing from Republicans, whether you're talking about this travel ban or whether you're talking about the latest tweet from President Trump, the controversial tweet over the weekend in which he accuses the former President Barack Obama of ordering a wiretap of his Trump Tower offices in New York during the presidential campaign last year. This despite the fact that the FBI, that reports to Trump's Justice Department, has called on the Justice Department to disavow the president's remarks because they say it would impugn the dignity of the FBI. It has just been denied by the Obama administration. It has been denied by Democrats. It requires a federal court judge to institute, and we have heard very muted remarks from the Republican Party in criticizing the Republican president, even on as overt a statement as the fact that the former president might or might not have phone tapped his offices. So Republicans are very, very cautious to broadly answer your question in criticizing this president, certainly in the public domain.
Now, Sherwin, you've been on the ground. How are Americans on the ground taking the news? Is this giving them a sense of relief?
Well, if you remember back to the initial order, I mean, it just resulted in a grassroots movement around this country in protesting. There are elements of this country, certainly Donald Trump supporters, that are very supportive of this travel ban. They believe that it will make America safer. They believe that this was an important tenet of his presidential campaign, and that as president, he is basically fulfilling his campaign promises. So a great deal of support, I think, from the Trump supporters, his base, if you want to call it that, but also from sort of Democrat, progressive liberals in this country, what we saw on the streets in January could repeat itself here. You know, we just a short time ago got a statement from the Washington State Attorney General, a Democrat, basically the state that pursued the initial order and managed to get it suspended in Seattle and in the San Francisco Appeals Court. That Attorney General has just issued a statement saying the following: by rescinding his earlier executive order, President Trump makes one thing perfectly clear. His original travel ban was indefensible, legally, constitutionally, and morally. We are carefully reviewing the new executive order to determine its impacts on Washington states and our next legal steps. I will have further comment later today. So it really comes down to a judicial question. Is this above legal muster, above legal challenge in the courts? And I think we will start to hear later in the day and certainly throughout this week whether certain states are going to object to this new executive order.
Now, Sherwin, let's go back to what you were saying earlier on around the accusations that President Trump has leveled against former President Obama. Would you say it's a case of him, you know, trying to divert attention from the things that are happening around him, especially with this revised travel ban?
Well, it's not even to deflect in terms of the travel ban. What pundits and what experts and analysts are saying, Tabile, that this was to try to deflect from calls from both parties in Congress and in the Senate for a special prosecutor to be appointed to investigate the Trump campaign and subsequently the Trump administration's connections to Russia. And so they feel that his angry tweets basically diverting attention from what many in the Republican Party felt was a very good performance from this president when he delivered his joint address to both houses of Congress earlier this week. They felt the whole Russian connection stories that were being punted certainly on the television airwaves was a distraction from that speech, and this was a very angry president. And so the speculation is that the only reason President Trump tweeted that former President Obama had tapped his phones was to divert attention from the very serious calls and the very serious accusations leveled against this administration that they are in bed with the Russians. And so in a sense that this is being seen more broadly here as a deflection from that very matter.
Sherwin, just finally, let's look at how the FBI is investigating scores of people admitted into the U.S. as refugees for suspected terror-linked activities. Do we know how these investigations are unfolding?
Well, the FBI certainly doesn't comment on what it is investigating, Tabile, and it certainly doesn't tell us how the methods that they are employing, certainly in terms of that investigation. What I can tell you, though, is that in late February, an internal report by the Department of Homeland Security basically said that to use a country of origin as a test for who might or might not import terrorism into the country is flawed. And so they do not believe, certainly in terms of this in this internal memo, that whether it's the 6 countries or the 7 countries or multiple countries from around the world, that it isn't a good test to determine who or who might not be importing terrorism into the United States. They also raise concerns about homegrown terrorism and the effect that travel bans of this nature might have on people that are already in the United States and how they might respond.
We'll have to leave it there, Sherwin. Thank you very much for that update. That was the SABC's UN Bureau Chief, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, joining us live.